Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, Jordan's state television has just announced that the government would free a prisoner in exchange for the release of a pilot that had been captured by Islamic State rebels last month. Jordan will release Sajida al-Rishawi, a woman convicted of being a suicide bomber, in response to an ISIS demand. ISIS had threatened to kill Jordanian pilot Moaz al-Qasasbeh, as well as a Japanese journalist. It is not yet clear if the journalist, Kenji Goto's life, will also be spared. Meanwhile, not far from Jordan, in Lebanon, cross-border hostilities with Israel have set off alarms this morning. The Lebanese group Hezbollah reportedly fired rockets into Israel, killing 2 Israeli soldiers and a Spanish member of the UN peacekeeping force. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to respond swiftly. Well, Courtney, what do you make of Jordan's decision to negotiate with ISIS? European countries have done the same, but the US has always refused.
Well, it seems that the Jordanian government's decision was at least partially motivated by intense pressure from the public, and in particular from al-Qasasbeh's family insisting on his safe return. Since his family began speaking out about the hostage crisis in December, there have been several demonstrations demanding the swap. And I think we're entering a point where the U.S. position of we don't negotiate with terrorists is just not tenable, since that has become increasingly one of the strategies that groups like ISIS are using in their campaign. So, Jordan is one of only 4 Arab countries that's participated in the serious strikes against ISIS, and there's been some dissension on the ground about that course of action. And so I think that Jordan is really feeling the heat on this one. But we also have to remember that all of this is taking place against a larger backdrop of nuclear negotiations with Iran, the likely reopening of conflict between Lebanon and Israel, and efforts by all the parties involved to really deal with the crisis of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. So there are really, I think, much larger issues that are at stake here that aren't being discussed in the conversation around this hostage negotiation.
Mexico's Attorney General has declared the 43 missing students from Ayotzinapa officially dead. The statement comes after months of protests rocked the nation over an incident that, to the Mexican public, symbolizes the worst of state collusion with corrupt police and violent drug gangs. At a press conference yesterday, Mr. Jesus Murillo Caram said, quote, "The evidence allows us to determine that the students were kidnapped, killed, burned, and thrown into the river." The mayor of Iguala, where the students went missing, has been charged with their kidnapping and killing. The Attorney General also made a statement about Mexico's most wanted drug kingpin, El Chapo Guzman, who was captured last year. Members of the U.S. Congress have called for El Chapo's extradition to the U.S., but Mr. Karam said it was a matter of Mexican national sovereignty that he remain in Mexico and face justice. El Chapo had been arrested once before, but managed to escape. Courtney, can the public trust Mexico's political leadership on these issues?
It's pretty doubtful. When we think about the Ayotzinapa case, this is a common tactic by the Mexican government to simply offer up bodies to placate the public and try to shut down the conversation. And we've seen this in the past in Juarez and in other parts of northern Mexico, where the state has failed to protect citizens, or, as is more often the case, they actually are responsible for the deaths of citizens. So we've seen this tactic before. We found the bodies case closed. I think in the case of El Chapo, though, the issue of extradition is really complicated. Certainly the United States, we generally don't allow other countries to try U.S. citizens who have committed crimes in their countries. And so, El Chapo definitely has lots of blood on his hands from Mexican citizens that he should answer for. But I think there's also a concern in Mexico that the prosecution of El Chapo is going to be a farce. We know that the Sinaloa cartel has had ties to the Mexican federal police as well as to the military. And the Sinaloa cartel, even though he was arrested, the Sinaloa cartel is still doing business, and business is very good. So I think there's a real concern that the Mexican government can't police the Sinaloa cartel because it would effectively mean policing itself. So no, there's not very much confidence, I think, in the Mexican government's ability to deal with these issues.
And finally, the state of Georgia executed an African-American man named Warren Lee Hill last night, who, according to lawyers, suffered from an intellectual disability. The execution took place at 7 p.m. after the U.S. Supreme Court refused to grant a stay, even though Justices Stephen Breyer and Sonia Sotomayor said they were in favor of it. The 2003 Supreme Court ruling bars the execution of mentally disabled inmates as unconstitutional, but it left it up to the states to decide on where to draw the line. The state of Georgia has set the highest bar for proof of intellectual disability in the nation. Hill's lawyer, Brian Kammer, hit back at the Supreme Court in its refusal to stay the execution, saying it, quote, unconscionably allowed a grotesque miscarriage of justice to occur in Georgia. Courtney, do you agree with the lawyer's characterization of what happened last night?
Oh, I certainly would agree with that. I mean, we know that this case came up multiple times. Federal judges in Georgia, ruled on two separate occasions that that Mr. Hill did meet the criteria for someone who suffered profound intellectual disability and therefore should not have been subjected to the death penalty, and that was not honored in this case. And so I think it was definitely a miscarriage of justice. But clearly the larger issue here is that we really need to reconsider our death penalty policy altogether, and that we should actually begin to initiate a conversation around abolition of the death penalty. We're one of the few developed countries in the world that continues this practice. And it's just not conscionable. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually rethink death penalty policy, generally speaking,
Right.
and not just the policing of people who are mentally unfit or mentally incompetent or
Right.
intellectually disabled.
Courtney Morris, thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again next time. Courtney Morris is our daily Newsflash guest expert and assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. We'll be right back.